The doors of the great hall burst open before Elena Voss could steady her breathing, and every eye in the room turned to her at once. She had not even reached the center of the stone floor when Alpha Damon Cross raised his hand and stopped the ceremony master mid-sentence. "Before this continues," Damon said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall without effort, "I want it understood by everyone here. This woman will wear the title of Luna. She will sit at my table. She will carry my name, but she will never carry my heart. This bond exists on paper only." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd, like wind through dry grass. Elena felt her face grow hot, but she did not let her shoulders drop. She had trained herself for years not to flinch in front of people who wanted to see her break. "Say it plainly, Alpha," she answered, lifting her chin. "Tell them I am Luna in name only. I already know it. You do not need to announce it as if it were news to me." A few gasps rose from the gathered wolves. No one spoke to an Alpha that way, especially not on the day of a binding. But Elena had nothing left to lose. Her pack, the Voss line, had been reduced to a handful of survivors after years of raids and broken alliances. This marriage was not a gift. It was the price of her people's survival, and she had agreed to pay it with her eyes open. Damon studied her for a long moment. Something flickered behind his gaze, gone before she could name it. Then his expression hardened again, and he turned back to the ceremony master. "Continue," he said flatly. The binding words were spoken. The mark was placed. It was done in less than 10 minutes, a transaction disguised as a sacred rite. When it ended, there was no cheering, no celebration, only the low murmur of a pack trying to decide what to make of their new, unwanted Luna. That night, Elena was shown to a room at the far end of the pack house, away from Damon's chambers, away from the heart of the household. A young pack member named Nora delivered her belongings without meeting her eyes. "The Alpha said you would want privacy," Nora mumbled. "Did he?" Elena said quietly. It was not a question. She did not cry once the door closed. She had promised herself long ago that she would not give anyone the satisfaction of her tears, not even in private, because tears had a way of becoming habits, and habits had a way of becoming identities. Instead, she unpacked her few belongings, folded her clothes into the narrow dresser, and sat by the window looking out over the training grounds, where the pack warriors moved through drills in the moonlight. She thought of her mother, who had died defending their last remaining territory. She thought of her younger brother, Ellis, who was safe now, only because of the treaty she had just sealed with her own life. Whatever indignity waited for her inside these walls, it was smaller than the alternative. She reminded herself of that fact, until sleep finally took her. The next morning, Elena rose before the sun and made her way to the kitchens, expecting to find them empty. Instead, she found a woman named Margaret, the head of the household staff, already awake and stirring a large pot of porridge. "You're up early for someone who was humiliated in front of the whole pack yesterday," Margaret said without looking up. Elena almost smiled. "I've been humiliated in front of bigger crowds. I find that porridge tastes the same either way." Margaret glanced at her then, something like curiosity crossing her weathered face. "Most Lunas, even the political ones, stay in bed and sulk for a week. You're the first one who's come looking for breakfast at dawn." "I'm not most Lunas," Elena said simply. "I'm barely a Luna at all, according to the Alpha." "Titles are one thing," Margaret said, sliding a bowl toward her. "What you do with your days is another. Nobody in this house has decided who you are yet. That part is still yours to write." Elena turned the words over in her mind as she ate. It was the first kindness anyone in Ashwood had shown her, and she held on to it like a small ember against the cold. Over the following days, Elena discovered exactly how far her authority did not extend. She was not invited to the council meetings where pack decisions were made. She was not given a role in managing the household beyond what any guest might do. When she asked one of the senior warriors, a broad-shouldered man named Simon, about the pack's patrol routes, he simply said, "That's not really your concern, Luna," and walked away before she could respond. She began to understand that her title was a formality, stitched onto the outside of pack life, never meant to reach the inside. Damon avoided her entirely, taking his meals separately, holding meetings behind closed doors, and speaking to her only when protocol demanded it. When their paths did cross in the hallways, his eyes would find hers for half a second, before sliding away, as if looking at her too long might cost him something he wasn't willing to spend. Elena refused to let the isolation shrink her. If she could not sit at the council table, she would learn the pack from its edges. She began spending time in the healing house, where an elderly woman named Beatrice ran the pack's medical care nearly single-handedly. Beatrice was overworked, her joints stiff with age, her assistant having left the pack months earlier for a mate in another territory. "You don't have to be here," Beatrice told her, the first time Elena rolled up her sleeves and asked what needed doing. "I know," Elena said. "I want to be useful. Nobody else seems interested in letting me." Beatrice studied her, the way Margaret had, assessing rather than judging. "Can you stitch a wound?" "I can stitch anything. My mother taught me, before she taught me to read." By the end of that first week, Elena had learned to prepare healing salves, wrap injuries from training accidents, and calm frightened young pack members, who came in scraped and crying, after falls from the practice yard walls. She did not do it to win favor. She did it because sitting alone in her room, waiting for a husband who would not look at her, felt like a slow kind of drowning, and useful work was the only rope she could find. Word of her efforts spread through the pack in the quiet way that word always does among people who live close together. The hostility in some eyes softened, just slightly, when she passed. Others remained cold, believing that a Luna from a broken pack had no business pretending she belonged among them. A woman named Rosalind, one of Damon's closest advisors, made her disdain for Elena obvious at every opportunity, finding reasons to question her presence in meetings she wasn't even attending. "She married into strength she didn't earn," Rosalind said one afternoon, not troubling to lower her voice as Elena passed the council room. "The Voss pack couldn't even protect its own borders. What exactly does she bring to Ashwood, besides a treaty neither side wanted?" Elena kept walking, refusing to give Rosalind the reaction she was fishing for, but the words lodged themselves under her skin anyway, a splinter she would carry for weeks. That evening, Damon found her in the healing house long after most of the pack had gone to sleep. She was cleaning instruments by lamplight, her sleeves still rolled to the elbow, a streak of dried salve across her wrist. "You shouldn't be working this late," he said from the doorway. Elena did not look up. "I wasn't aware you kept track of my schedule." "I don't," he said, too quickly. "Beatrice mentioned it. She worries." "Beatrice worries about everyone. It's why the pack trusts her." Elena finally met his eyes. "Is there something you needed, Alpha?" He hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might actually say something honest. Instead, his jaw tightened, and the wall came back up. "No, only checking that the healing house is secure for the night." "It is," Elena said, "as it has been every night since I arrived, whether or not you checked." He left without another word, but Elena noticed, as she gathered her things to return to her room, that he had lingered at the door a second longer than necessary, before disappearing into the dark hallway. She told herself it meant nothing. She had learned not to build hope out of small moments, because small moments had betrayed her before. But that night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling of her narrow room, she found herself replaying the sound of his voice, the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, and wondering, despite every warning in her own mind, what exactly he was afraid of showing her. Days folded into weeks. Elena built a quiet rhythm for herself. Mornings in the kitchen with Margaret, afternoons in the healing house with Beatrice, evenings spent walking the training grounds after the warriors had dispersed, watching the moon rise over Ashwood's high stone walls. She was not accepted, not fully, but she was no longer invisible either. Children in the pack had begun waving to her. A few of the younger warriors nodded respectfully when she passed. Even Simon, who had once brushed her off about the patrol routes, started greeting her by name. Only Damon remained a locked door. And every night, before sleep finally claimed her, Elena found herself wondering what exactly he was hiding behind it, and whether she would ever be given the chance to find out. Far to the north, in a territory bordered by dense pine forest, a different kind of attention was turning toward Ashwood. News of the Voss Cross Treaty had traveled faster than anyone in Ashwood realized, carried along old trade routes, and whispered between packs who remembered the name Voss from years before the raids had nearly erased it. In a stone hall not unlike Damon's own, an alpha named Cain Reyes sat with a folded letter in his hand, reading the name Elena Voss for the second time that evening, his expression unreadable to the advisors seated around him. He did not speak of it that night, but he did not burn the letter either. He folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat, close to his chest, the way a man keeps something he intends to return to. Elena, unaware of the eyes now turning toward Ashwood's borders, spent that same evening exactly as she had spent the ones before it, alone, useful, and quietly wondering how much longer she could stand being married to a man who refused to let her matter. She did not yet know that the answer to that question was about to change, not through anything she did, but through a threat that would soon arrive at Ashwood's gates and force Damon Cross to decide, once and for all, exactly how little or how much his silent, overlooked Luna truly meant to him. Elena's days at Ashwood had settled into something she almost recognized as routine, but routine at Ashwood still meant standing at the edge of every room she entered. The pack had grown used to seeing her at the healing house, in the kitchen, and walking the training grounds at dusk, yet none of that presence had translated into any real standing within the pack's decisions. She was known, she was not consulted. One morning, a messenger arrived at the gates with urgent news from the eastern border, near a small settlement called Fenmore, that fell under Ashwood's protection. Rogue wolves, unaffiliated with any pack, had been spotted moving through the woods near the village, and reports suggested livestock had already been lost. Damon called an emergency council meeting, and, as always, Elena was not summoned. She learned about the threat from Margaret, who had heard it from one of the kitchen staff, who had heard it from a warrior passing through for a meal. By the time the information reached Elena, the council had already been meeting for over an hour. She did not wait to be invited. She walked to the council room, knocked once, and entered before anyone could tell her not to. The room fell silent. Damon sat at the head of a long table, Rosalind and Simon flanking him, along with several other senior pack members Elena recognized only by sight. Maps of the eastern border were spread across the table, marked with red ink where sightings had been reported. "Luna," Damon said, his tone carefully neutral. "This is a closed meeting." "I understand that," Elena said. "I also understand that Fenmore has been left with almost no protection, because most of your warriors were reassigned to the Northern Watch last month. I know, because I treated 3 of them for training injuries, and they mentioned it while I stitched their wounds." A flicker of surprise passed across several faces at the table. Rosalind's mouth tightened. "This is not the place for gossip from the healing house," Rosalind said. "It isn't gossip," Elena replied evenly. "It's information you apparently didn't have, since your maps still mark full patrol coverage along that stretch of border." She stepped closer to the table and pointed to the section in question. "If rogues are already moving toward Fenmore, and your nearest response team is 2 hours out because of the northern reassignment, you will lose that village before help arrives." The room was quiet. Damon studied the map, then looked up at her, with an expression she couldn't quite place, somewhere between irritation and reluctant respect. "How do you know the Northern Watch numbers?" he asked. "Because I listen," Elena said simply, something this council might try more often. Simon, to Elena's surprise, was the first to speak in her defense. "She's right about the patrol gap. I flagged it to command 2 weeks ago and never got a response." Damon's jaw tightened, clearly displeased that a communication failure inside his own pack had gone unnoticed, until his sidelined Luna pointed it out in front of everyone. He turned back to the map, recalculating routes, reassigning warriors, his voice sharp and fast as he issued new orders. "I'm going with the response team," Elena said. "Absolutely not," Damon answered immediately. "You need someone who can treat injuries in the field, and Beatrice's joints won't survive that ride. I can. I'm not asking permission, Alpha. I'm telling you what I intend to do." The room held its breath, waiting for Damon's temper to answer hers. Instead, after a long, tense pause, he simply said, "Fine. You ride with Simon's team. You follow his lead on the ground. No arguments." "Understood," Elena said, already turning to leave and prepare. The ride to Fenmore took just under 2 hours through dense forest trails, Elena keeping pace with warriors trained for exactly this kind of urgency. When they arrived, the village was in chaos. Several rogue wolves had already broken through the outer fencing, and villagers were being herded toward the central hall for safety, while a handful of untrained locals tried to hold the line with little more than farming tools. Elena did not hesitate. While Simon's team engaged the rogues directly, she moved through the panicked crowd, directing families toward shelter, calming children who had been separated from their parents, and setting up a triage space in the village hall for the injuries she knew were coming. Her voice remained steady, even as the sounds of the fight echoed close by, and villagers who had never met her before found themselves following her instructions without question, drawn to the calm certainty in her manner. When the fighting ended, and the rogues had been driven off, the injuries began arriving at the hall in a steady stream. Elena worked without rest, cleaning wounds, setting a broken arm, stopping bleeding with hands that did not shake despite the chaos around her. Simon, favoring a gashed shoulder, watched her work with something like astonishment. "You've done this before," he said, wincing as she cleaned the wound. "More times than I can count," Elena said. "My old pack didn't have the luxury of a large healing staff. Everyone learned to patch each other up, or we didn't survive." By the time the last injury had been treated and the village had begun to settle, night had fully fallen. Elena stepped outside the hall to breathe air that didn't smell like salve and blood, and found Damon waiting near the horses, having ridden out himself once word of the attack reached Ashwood. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in the dried blood on her hands, the exhaustion in her eyes, the steadiness she still carried despite it all. "You could have been killed," he said quietly. "So could you. Every time you ride into a fight," Elena answered. "You don't hear me telling you not to do your duty. You're not a warrior." "No," she agreed. "I'm a healer. And tonight, Fenmore needed one more than it needed another sword. If I had stayed behind because you were afraid, people in that hall would have died waiting for help that was still 2 hours away." Damon said nothing for a long moment, his eyes moving over the village behind her, the lanterns now lit in windows that would have gone dark tonight without her intervention. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of the coldness she had grown used to. "Thank you," he said, "for what you did tonight." It was such a small thing, 2 simple words, but Elena felt them land somewhere deep, somewhere she had guarded carefully since the day of her humiliation in the great hall. She nodded, unable to trust her voice not to shake if she said more. They rode back to Ashwood mostly in silence, but it was a different silence than before, less like a locked door and more like a held breath. When they reached the pack house, Damon dismounted first and, without thinking, reached up to help her down from her horse. His hands lingered at her waist half a second longer than necessary before he stepped back, as if realizing what he'd done. "You should rest," he said, his voice rough. "You did well tonight, Elena." It was the first time he had used her name instead of her title. She watched him walk away, his shoulders less rigid than she had ever seen them, and something in her chest loosened just slightly, a knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying since her first day at Ashwood. News of Fenmore spread through the pack quickly, and this time, the story that traveled was not about a Luna in name only, but about a Luna who had ridden into danger and saved lives with her own steady hands. Even Rosalind, though she said nothing directly to Elena, seemed to watch her with a new, wary kind of attention, as if recalculating something she had assumed was settled. Elena did not let the shift go to her head. She understood that one night, however significant, did not erase weeks of coldness, and she was not interested in being tolerated only because she had proven useful in a crisis. But something had changed between her and Damon, a small crack in the wall he had built around himself, and though neither of them spoke of it directly, both of them felt it every time their paths crossed in the days that followed. He began seeking her out in small ways he hadn't before, asking Beatrice about the healing house's supply needs, and making sure they were met without Elena having to ask twice. He started attending some of the same evening walks along the training grounds, keeping a respectful distance but no longer disappearing the moment she appeared. Their conversations remained careful, guarded, neither of them willing to fully open the doors they had shut against each other. But there was warmth now, where there had only been cold formality, and Elena found herself, against every instinct that told her not to hope, beginning to wonder if the man behind Ashwood's alpha title might be someone worth knowing after all. She did not yet understand what had built those walls in the first place, what old wound made him so unwilling to let anyone close. But she was patient, and she was determined, and she had already survived enough in her life to know that some of the strongest bonds were built not from ease, but from standing together in the middle of a crisis and choosing not to look away. What she could not have known, As she settled into her narrow bed that night, with the sound of Damon's quiet thank you still echoing in her mind, was that the crack she had opened in his defenses had also caught the attention of someone far more dangerous than Rosalind's disapproval. Someone who had been waiting patiently, letter folded close to his chest, for the right moment to remind Elena Voss that Ashwood was not the only pack willing to fight for her. The days following Fenmore carried a new energy through Ashwood, and Elena found herself, for the first time since her binding, walking through the pack house without feeling like a stranger inside her own home. Warriors who had once looked past her now greeted her by name. Villagers from Fenmore sent word of thanks that made its way back to the pack house, praising the Luna who had stayed through the chaos to treat their wounded. Even the kitchen staff seemed to move a little easier around her, as though her steadiness that night had answered a question they had all been quietly asking about her. But comfort, Elena had learned long ago, rarely lasted without challenge. It was a gray afternoon when the gate horn sounded, 3 long blasts that meant visitors of high standing had arrived. Elena was in the healing house, helping Beatrice sort dried herbs when the sound reached them, and Beatrice's hands paused mid-motion. "That's not a trade horn," Beatrice said, frowning. "That's for a visiting alpha." Elena wiped her hands and moved to the window that overlooked the front courtyard. A procession had entered through Ashwood's gates, banners bearing an unfamiliar crest rippling in the wind, dark green stitched with a silver hawk. At the head of the procession rode a man Elena had never seen before, broad-shouldered and composed, his dark eyes sweeping over the pack house with the confidence of someone who expected to be recognized wherever he traveled. "Who is that?" Elena asked. Beatrice's frown deepened. "That crest belongs to Thornfield. That's Alpha Cain Reyes." The name meant nothing to Elena at first, but the tension that immediately rippled through the courtyard told her it meant a great deal to everyone else. Warriors straightened their posture. Rosalind appeared at the entrance to greet the procession with a formality Elena had never seen her extend to anyone. And Damon, when he emerged from the pack house to meet his visitor, wore an expression Elena had not seen on him before: guarded, careful, and unmistakably wary. "Cain," Damon said, his voice even but cool. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" Cain said, dismounting with easy grace. "I would have thought word of my visit might have traveled ahead of me. Apparently your boarders are less informed than they used to be." His eyes moved past Damon, sweeping the courtyard, until they landed on Elena standing at the healing house window. Something in his expression shifted, sharpened, though his voice remained pleasant. "Ah, there she is." Elena felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She stepped outside, unsure why she had been singled out, but unwilling to hide from whatever was unfolding. "Elena Voss," Cain said, inclining his head toward her, with a formality that felt almost theatrical. "It has been a long time." "I don't believe we've met," Elena said carefully. "We haven't," Cain admitted, though not for lack of intention on my part. 3 years ago, before your pack's territory was lost to the raids, my father began negotiations with your family for a match between us. Your mother and I exchanged letters for nearly a year before the raids made further contact impossible. He glanced at Damon, something almost triumphant flickering across his face. "I had every intention of finishing what my father started. It seems, however, that I arrived a treaty too late." Elena's mind raced backward, searching for some memory of this arrangement, some conversation her mother might have had with her about it. She found only vague fragments, her mother mentioning a promising alliance in the north before the raids destroyed any hope of pursuing it. A name she had never learned because the negotiations had collapsed along with everything else. She had never known it was Cain Reyes. "I know nothing of any arrangement," Elena said honestly. "I'm not surprised," Cain said, his tone gentling. "Your mother was protecting you from disappointment, I imagine, given how quickly the negotiations fell apart once your pack came under attack. I searched for years afterward, trying to learn what became of the Voss line. By the time I found record of your treaty with Ashwood, the binding had already been completed." His eyes moved briefly to the mark at Elena's collarbone, the physical proof of her joining with Damon, and something like regret crossed his face before he composed himself again. "I am not here to cause conflict, Alpha Cross. I came only to see for myself that Elena was being treated as she deserves." The words landed with quiet precision, a challenge disguised as concern. Damon's expression remained carefully neutral, but Elena, who had spent weeks learning to read the small tells beneath his composure, saw the tension tighten in his jaw. "She is my Luna," Damon said, "treated exactly as she deserves." "Is she?" Kane said, glancing toward Rosalind and the assembled pack members, several of whom shifted uncomfortably at the question. Word of Elena's early treatment at Ashwood, the public declaration that she would be Luna in name only, had clearly traveled farther than Damon might have wished. "Forgive me if I have doubts." Elena felt heat rise to her face, caught between two men discussing her future, as though she weren't standing directly between them. "I am capable of speaking for myself," she said sharply, drawing both their attention back to her. "Alpha Reyes, I appreciate your concern, but my circumstances are not yours to negotiate." Kane's expression softened into something that looked almost like admiration. "Of course. Forgive my presumption. I only ask that you consider, in the time I remain here, that there are packs who would value you as more than a political arrangement." He inclined his head once more, formal and unhurried. "I've requested permission from Alpha Cross to stay in Ashwood for a short time, to observe the border tensions that have been reported in this region. I hope my presence will not be an inconvenience." Damon's jaw was tight enough that Elena worried he might refuse outright, which would have been within his right, but would also have signaled exactly the kind of insecurity Kane seemed to be probing for. After a long pause, Damon nodded once, stiffly. "You may stay in the guest quarters, 3 days." "Generous," Kane said, though his tone suggested he had expected exactly that answer. "Thank you, Alpha Cross." As the procession was led toward the guest quarters, Elena found herself standing alone with Damon in the courtyard, the tension between them thick enough to feel physical. "You didn't tell me about a prior arrangement," Damon said, his voice low. "Because I didn't know," Elena said, matching his tone. "I told you, I know nothing about Kane Reyes beyond what he said 5 minutes ago. Do you think I've been hiding some secret courtship?" "I don't know what to think," Damon admitted, and there was something raw in the admission that surprised her. "He looks at you like he already knows how this ends." "Then perhaps you should stop looking at me like you're waiting for me to prove I don't belong here," Elena snapped, months of frustration breaking through her usual composure. "You spent weeks making sure the entire pack knew this marriage meant nothing to you. Don't be surprised that another alpha noticed the opening you left." She turned and walked away before he could respond, her hands trembling slightly as she made her way back toward the healing house, furious at Kane for arriving with his easy charm and old promises, furious at Damon for the coldness that had made his arrival possible, and furious at herself for the small, treacherous part of her that had noticed the flicker of jealousy in Damon's eyes, and felt something unwillingly warm bloom in response. That evening, unable to settle, Elena walked the training grounds alone, needing air and space to untangle the day's events. She had not gone far when she heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find Kane approaching, his earlier formality replaced by something more relaxed, though no less deliberate. "I didn't mean to upset your evening," he said. "You upset considerably more than my evening," Elena replied. "You arrived at my home and announced a courtship I knew nothing about, in front of my husband's entire pack." "I apologize for the manner of it," Kane said, and he sounded, to her surprise, genuinely sincere. "I've thought of finding you for years, Elena. When I learned of the Ashwood Treaty, and how it was announced, I confess, I let my frustration outweigh my patience." "How it was announced," Elena repeated. "You know about that. Word travels between packs faster than you might think, especially word about an alpha publicly humiliating his new Luna on her binding day." Kane's expression turned gentle. "I'm not here to make your life more difficult. I only want you to know that you have options you may not believe you have. Thornfield would welcome you as an equal, not an obligation." Elena studied him carefully, searching for the manipulation she expected to find beneath his words, but found instead what seemed to be genuine conviction. It unsettled her more than outright deception would have. "I made a binding," she said finally. "Whatever its beginning, it isn't something I can simply walk away from, because a better offer arrived." "I'm not asking you to walk away from anything tonight," Kane said. "I'm only asking you to remember, in the days I remain here, that walls built by fear rarely make good foundations for a life. You deserve better than being tolerated, Elena. Whether that better comes from Ashwood or from somewhere else, I hope you find it." He left her alone on the training grounds with those words settling heavily in her chest, and Elena stood beneath the rising moon for a long time afterward, unsure for the first time since her binding exactly what she wanted her future to hold, or which of the two alphas now vying, in their very different ways, for her attention, actually understood her at all. Kane's 3 days in Ashwood stretched into a week, then 2, as border tensions he claimed to be monitoring gave him repeated reasons to extend his stay. Damon, unwilling to appear threatened by granting the extensions or petty by refusing them, allowed it, though the strain of the arrangement showed in the tightness around his eyes each time Kane's name was mentioned. Elena found herself caught in the middle of a slow, deliberate courtship she had never asked for. Kane was patient and consistent, appearing at meals she attended, offering to walk with her to the healing house, always respectful, always careful to frame his attention as simple friendship, even as the intention beneath it remained unmistakable. He asked about her work with Beatrice, listened when she spoke about her lost family, and remembered small details from their conversations that he brought up days later, proving he had actually been listening, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. It was, Elena admitted to herself reluctantly, a stark contrast to the silence she had endured from Damon for weeks after her binding. "He's charming," Margaret observed one morning, watching through the kitchen window as Kane crossed the courtyard toward the healing house, clearly intending to find Elena there. "I'll give him that." "Charming isn't the same as honest," Elena said, though she wasn't entirely certain she believed her own words anymore. "No," Margaret agreed. "But it's not nothing either, especially after the winter you've had here." Elena didn't answer, because she didn't have a response that felt true in every direction at once. She had spent weeks being frozen out by the very man she was bound to, made to feel like an obligation rather than a person, and now here was another alpha offering warmth, attention, and an alternative future, without a single locked door standing between them. It would have been easy, dangerously easy, to let herself lean into what Kane offered. And yet, there had been the ride to Fenmore. There had been Damon's hands lingering at her waist. There had been the 2 words, "Thank you," spoken in a voice stripped of its usual armor. Small moments, easy to dismiss, but they had lodged themselves in her chest, in a way Kane's practiced charm never quite managed to match. Damon, for his part, watched Kane's growing presence in Elena's days, with a jealousy he refused to name aloud, but could not quite hide either. He began finding reasons of his own to be near the healing house in the afternoons, reasons that grew increasingly transparent to everyone but himself. He started attending the pack's shared evening meals, something he had avoided since the binding, seating himself near Elena, with a possessiveness that felt entirely at odds with his earlier declaration that this marriage meant nothing to him. "You've been eating dinner with the pack all week," Elena observed one evening, watching him settle into the seat across from her, with more purpose than the simple act required. "I've decided it's important for the alpha to be visible to his people," Damon said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Is that the reason?" Elena said, unable to keep the dry edge from her voice. "It has nothing to do with the fact that Alpha Reyes has been visible to your Luna every day for 2 weeks. Damon's jaw tightened, confirming her suspicion, even as he refused to admit it outright. "Kane Reyes should not be given free rein to court a married woman under my own roof." "Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you told your entire pack, on our binding day, that I would never matter to you," Elena said, keeping her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the surrounding tables, though the sharpness in it was unmistakable. "You cannot claim jealousy over something you threw away yourself." Damon said nothing for a long moment, his hands tightening around the edge of the table. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its usual control. "I never said you didn't matter. You said I would carry your name and never your heart," Elena reminded him. "In front of everyone. What was I supposed to take from that, if not exactly what you told me to take from it?" "I was protecting." He stopped himself abruptly, the sentence cut off before it could finish, and something flickered across his face that looked almost like fear. "Protecting what?" Elena pressed, leaning forward slightly. "Yourself? From what, exactly?" But Damon shook his head, the wall sliding back into place with visible effort. "It doesn't matter. Forget I said anything." "It clearly matters," Elena said. "You can't keep doing this, Damon. You can't be cold enough to hand me over to disappointment on our binding day. and then jealous enough to sit beside me every night for 2 weeks, without ever explaining why. It isn't fair, not to me, and I suspect, not to yourself either." He didn't answer. He simply sat there, silent, his eyes fixed on some middle distance she couldn't follow, and after a long, unbearable pause, Elena rose from the table and left him there, unwilling to keep chasing explanations he clearly wasn't ready to give. That night, restless and frustrated, she found herself walking the training grounds again, and this time it was Kane who found her, as though he had been waiting for the opportunity. "You look troubled," he said gently. "I'm tired," Elena admitted, too exhausted from the evening's tension to guard her words as carefully as usual. "Tired of walls I don't understand, and tired of being caught in the middle of a decision that was never fully mine to make." "Then let me offer you something simpler," Kane said. "Come to Thornfield. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but when you're ready. I will not pretend the path would be without complication, given your binding to Ashwood. But I would give you a life without walls, Elena. I would give you a title that means what it says." Elena looked at him for a long moment, weighing the simplicity of what he offered against the complicated, unresolved ache that Damon stirred in her despite everything. Kane was safe. Kane was clear. Kane had never once made her feel like an afterthought. But safety, she realized with some surprise, was not the same thing as truth, and the ache Damon caused her, however frustrating, felt more honest than anything Kane had offered her in 2 weeks of careful, practiced warmth. "I need time," she said finally, which was not the refusal Kane might have hoped to avoid, but was not the acceptance he'd been working toward either. "Take all the time you need," Kane said, though something in his eyes suggested his patience, however genuine, was not without its limits. "But know that Thornfield's door remains open, Elena, for as long as you need it to." He left her alone with the moon and her own tangled thoughts, and Elena stood there long after his footsteps had faded, staring toward the pack house, where she knew Damon was likely still sitting exactly where she'd left him, wrestling with whatever truth he refused to speak aloud. She did not yet know that the answer to his silence had a name, a history, and a wound old enough to explain every wall he had built. She only knew that she was running out of patience for guessing, and that somewhere beyond Ashwood's borders, Kane Reyes was running out of patience too, in a way that would soon force all 3 of them toward a reckoning none of them could avoid. The truth, when it finally arrived, did not come from Damon himself, but from Beatrice, who had watched the tension between the Alpha and his Luna stretch tighter with each passing day, and decided Elena deserved to understand what she was truly up against. It happened on a quiet afternoon in the healing house, the 2 of them alone, while rain tapped steadily against the windows. Elena had been unusually quiet all day, her mind clearly still tangled in the argument from the night before, and Beatrice, setting down the herbs she'd been sorting, finally spoke. "You want to know why he's like this?" Beatrice said. It wasn't a question. Elena looked up, startled. "I wasn't going to ask." "You didn't have to. It's written all over you." Beatrice settled into the chair across from her, her old joints protesting the movement. "I've been with this pack since before Damon was born, Elena. I watched him grow into the Alpha he is now, and I watched what nearly broke him before he became that man." Elena set down her own work, giving Beatrice her full attention. "Tell me." "Before you, there was another Luna," Beatrice began. "Her name was Celeste. She came from a neighboring pack, much like you did, though her circumstances were different. Damon was young, only recently confirmed as Alpha after his father's death, and he fell for her completely. He gave her everything. His trust, his authority, access to pack decisions most Lunas never touch. He believed, with the full certainty of a young man in love for the first time, that she felt the same." "What happened?" Elena asked quietly. "She was working with a rival pack the entire time," Beatrice said, her voice heavy with old grief. "Feeding them information about our patrol routes, our defenses, our weaknesses. It took nearly a year before Damon uncovered it, and by then the damage was severe. We lost warriors, we lost territory. We nearly lost the pack standing entirely. And when it was over, when Celeste was gone, and the wreckage was finally being counted, Damon blamed himself more than anyone else did. He had given her everything, and she had used every piece of it against the people he was sworn to protect." Elena sat in stunned silence, pieces of the past weeks suddenly rearranging themselves into a picture that finally made sense. The coldness, the distance, the declaration on their binding day that had felt so cruel and unnecessary. He wasn't protecting himself from me, Elena said slowly. He was protecting the pack, from doing again what he'd already done once. That's my belief, Beatrice said. He built that wall the day Celeste left, and he swore he'd never give another Luna the kind of access and trust that nearly destroyed his pack. It wasn't fair to you, Elena. You didn't deserve to inherit another woman's betrayal. But grief like that doesn't always reason its way to fairness. It just survives however it can. Elena thought of the words Damon had started and stopped at dinner the night before. I was protecting. The sentence he hadn't finished suddenly made painful, complete sense. Why are you telling me this now? Elena asked. Because you deserve to understand the man you're bound to, Beatrice said simply. And because I've watched you these past weeks, Elena, and I don't believe you're anything like Celeste. I think Damon knows that too, somewhere beneath all that armor. He's just too afraid to test the theory and be wrong again. Elena left the healing house that afternoon with her mind racing, the rain still falling steadily around her as she walked toward the pack house, uncertain exactly what she intended to say to Damon, but knowing she could no longer let the silence between them stand unchallenged. She found him in his study, alone, a stack of unread reports pushed aside, as he stared out the window at the rain-soaked training grounds. He looked up when she entered, surprise crossing his face at the unannounced visit. Elena. Is something wrong? I know about Celeste, she said without preamble. His entire body went still. For a long moment he said nothing, his expression unreadable, and Elena wondered if she'd made a mistake in confronting him so directly. Then, slowly, some of the tension seemed to drain out of his shoulders, as if a weight he'd been carrying alone for years had finally been set down, even partially. Beatrice told you, he said. It wasn't an accusation. She thought I deserved to understand, Elena said. She was right. Damon rose from his desk and moved to the window, his back to her, his voice quiet when he finally spoke. I gave her everything, Elena. Every piece of trust I had, and she used it to nearly destroy everything I was sworn to protect. When the treaty with your pack came through, when I realized I would have to bind myself to another stranger, I told myself I would never make that mistake again. I would keep the title separate from anything real. I would protect the pack by protecting myself from ever trusting a Luna again. So you decided, before you even met me, that I would be punished for what she did, Elena said, not unkindly, but firmly enough that he turned to face her. I know it wasn't fair, he said. I knew it the moment I said those words, in front of the entire pack. I saw your face, and I knew I'd hurt you for no reason you deserved, but I didn't know how to stop myself. The fear was already there, waiting for a reason to speak. I'm not her, Damon, Elena said, closing the distance between them. I never asked for access to your pack's secrets. I never wanted anything from you, except to be treated like a person, instead of a political inconvenience. I rode to Fenmore, because people needed help, not because I was trying to prove myself worthy of your trust. I've spent weeks earning my place in this pack from the outside in, because you gave me no other choice. I know, Damon said, and the rawness in his voice was unlike anything she'd heard from him before. I've watched you do it, Elena, every day, and every day it's gotten harder to remember why I built that wall in the first place. They stood close now, close enough that Elena could see the exhaustion behind his eyes, the years of guarded loneliness he'd carried since Celeste's betrayal, and something in her softened despite every reason she had to remain guarded herself. I can't promise you certainty, she said quietly. Nobody can. But I can promise you that I've never once lied to you, and I don't intend to start now. If you want this bond to mean something, Damon, you have to be willing to risk being wrong about me. I can't keep proving myself to a closed door. Damon reached out, hesitant, and brushed his fingers lightly against her hand, the first deliberate touch he'd initiated since their binding. I don't want the door closed anymore, he said. I'm just afraid I don't know how to open it without breaking something. Then we'll figure it out together, Elena said. Slowly, if we have to, but together. For the first time since her arrival at Ashwood, something like real hope settled between them. Fragile, but undeniable. A foundation finally being built on honesty, instead of silence. But even as the walls between Damon and Elena began to soften, a different kind of tension was building beyond Ashwood's borders. Cain Reyes, watching from the guest quarters as Elena's visits to his company grew shorter and less frequent, understood exactly what the change in her demeanor meant. He had given her time, patience, and every gentle argument he could offer, and still she was choosing the man who had once humiliated her over the alliance Cain had spent years hoping to claim. That night, alone in his quarters, Cain made a decision he had been holding in reserve since his arrival, one that pack law rarely required but had never forbidden either. The invocation of an old rite, nearly forgotten in most modern packs, that allowed a rejected suitor with a prior legitimate claim to formally challenge a binding under specific, ancient conditions. He did not act that night, but he began, quietly and deliberately, preparing the request that would soon force Ashwood and Thornfield into a confrontation neither Elena nor Damon could see coming, one that would test everything they had only just begun to rebuild between them. The formal challenge arrived 3 mornings later, delivered not by messenger but by Cain himself, who requested an audience with the full Ashwood Council, rather than a private meeting with Damon alone. Elena, summoned this time as a matter of course rather than an afterthought, stood beside Damon at the head of the council table, as Cain laid out his claim with the same calm, deliberate confidence he brought to everything he did. "By the old right of prior claim," Cain said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "I formally challenge the binding between Alpha Damon Cross and Elena Voss. My negotiations with the Voss line predate this treaty by more than 3 years, interrupted only by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Pack law recognizes this right, however rarely invoked in recent generations, and I intend to see it honored." Murmurs spread through the council members present, several exchanging uncertain glances. Rosalind, to Elena's surprise, looked genuinely troubled rather than pleased, as though even she had not anticipated the situation escalating this far. "This right has not been formally invoked in over 2 generations, Damon said, his voice tightly controlled. "You would drag 2 packs into open conflict over a claim most consider ceremonial at best." "I would drag 2 packs into open conflict over a woman I believe deserves better than what she was given," Cain countered. "You said yourself, in front of your own pack, that this binding meant nothing to you. I am simply holding you to your own words, Alpha Cross." Elena felt every eye in the room shift toward her, waiting to see how she would respond, but it was Damon who spoke first, his voice carrying a certainty that silenced the murmuring instantly. "Those words were a mistake," Damon said, "one I have spent every day since trying to correct. Elena Voss is my Luna, in every sense that matters, not merely on paper. I will not release this binding, and I will not allow you to invoke an old right built on words I no longer stand behind." Cain's expression tightened, some of his composure slipping for the first time since his arrival. "Then it seems we have arrived at an impasse pack law was designed to resolve. If the challenge is refused, tradition allows for a formal contest between the 2 claiming packs, the outcome of which settles the matter permanently." The room went utterly silent. Elena understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, exactly what Cain was proposing. Not diplomacy, not further negotiation, but an actual conflict between Ashwood and Thornfield, warriors on both sides risking their lives over a claim that had begun as old correspondence between 2 packs that no longer even fully existed in their original form. "You would risk your own warriors' lives over this," Elena said, finally finding her voice, directing the question at Cain, with disbelief evident in her tone. "I would risk everything for the chance you deserved, from the beginning," Cain said, and for the first time, Elena heard something beneath his usual composure that sounded almost desperate. "I have spent years searching for you, Elena. I will not simply walk away because Alpha Cross has finally decided to value what he nearly threw away. This isn't about what I deserve," Elena said sharply. "This is about you refusing to accept that I have made my own choice. I told you I needed time. I never told you I would choose Thornfield." "You didn't need to," Cain said quietly. "I could see it in your eyes the moment you walked into this room beside him. I simply refused to accept it, without giving you the chance to see what you'd be walking away from." Damon stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Elena, though not in a way that silenced her, simply in a way that made his intentions unmistakably clear. "If Thornfield wishes to press this challenge to its conclusion, Ashwood will answer it. But understand, Cain, that you are not fighting for a treaty or an old letter. You are fighting a pack that will defend its Luna with everything it has. The declaration landed with weight through the council room, and Elena felt something shift inside her chest at the certainty in Damon's voice, the complete absence of hesitation, where once there had been nothing but careful distance. Cain studied Damon for a long moment, then inclined his head, formal once more despite the tension still radiating from him. Then it seems Thornfield and Ashwood have a contest to prepare for. 3 days, as tradition dictates, before the formal engagement at the shared border. I trust you will use them wisely. Alpha Cross. He turned to leave, pausing only to look back at Elena one final time. I am sorry it has come to this. I never wanted to cause you harm, Elena. I only wanted to give you the chance to choose freely, without the weight of an old wound clouding your judgment. I have chosen freely, Elena said firmly. You simply don't like the answer. Cain said nothing further. He left the council room, and moments later, the sound of Thornfield's procession departing through Ashwood's gates echoed through the courtyard, carrying with it the certainty that in 3 days, 2 packs would meet at the border, and lives would be risked over a binding that had begun as nothing more than a political necessity. The council room erupted into activity the moment Cain's procession was out of sight, warriors and advisors already discussing strategy, supply lines, and defensive positioning. Elena stood at the center of it, feeling suddenly, overwhelmingly responsible for a conflict she had never asked for and could not undo. This is because of me, she said quietly to Damon once the room had begun to clear. This is because Cain refuses to accept that people are allowed to change, Damon said, turning to face her fully. You are not responsible for another man's stubbornness, Elena. I made a mistake on our binding day that gave him room to believe he had a claim worth pursuing. If anyone bears responsibility for where we've arrived, it's me. We don't have time to argue about blame, Elena said, pushing past the guilt threatening to overwhelm her in favor of the urgency the situation demanded. We have 3 days. What do you need from me? Damon looked at her for a long moment, something like wonder crossing his face at the question, at the way she had positioned herself instantly at his side rather than retreating from the conflict unfolding around her. I need the healing house, fully prepared, he said finally. Whatever happens at that border, we will need every skilled hand we have. And I need you safe, Elena. Which means staying behind the front lines, no matter how much I suspect you'll want to argue about it. I won't argue about staying out of direct combat, Elena said. But I won't be tucked away somewhere useless either. Wherever the wounded end up, that's where I'll be. Over the following 3 days, Ashwood transformed into a pack, preparing for conflict. Warriors trained with renewed intensity. Beatrice and Elena worked side by side, stalking the healing house with every supply they could gather, anticipating a scale of injury Ashwood had not faced in years. Damon spent long hours in strategy meetings, but for the first time, he included Elena in those discussions as well, valuing her insight on troop placement near Fenmore, where she had gained first-hand knowledge of the eastern terrain during the earlier crisis. The pack that had once treated Elena as an outsider now looked to her as someone genuinely invested in their survival, and the shift was not lost on her. Even Rosalind, who found Elena in the healing house late on the second night, offered something close to an apology. I misjudged you, Rosalind said stiffly, watching Elena organize bandages with practiced efficiency. I assumed a Luna from a broken pack would bring nothing but weakness to Ashwood. I was wrong. I appreciate you saying so, Elena said, though I'd rather earn your respect through what happens next than through words alone. You already have, Rosalind said, and left, before the moment could grow more uncomfortable than either of them wanted to sustain. On the night before the contest, Elena found Damon alone on the training grounds, staring toward the eastern border where, by tomorrow's dusk, everything between Ashwood and Thornfield would be decided one way or another. She approached quietly and stood beside him, saying nothing at first, simply offering her presence in the silence. Whatever happens tomorrow, Damon said finally, I need you to know that the words I said on our binding day were the greatest mistake of my life. Not because of what they cost me with Cain, but because of what they nearly cost me with you, before I ever gave myself the chance to know you. I know, Elena said softly. I think I've known for a while now. He turned to face her, and in the moonlight, The careful distance that had once defined every interaction between them was entirely absent. I love you, Elena. Not the title, not the treaty. You. I should have said it before Kane forced my hand, and I'm sorry it took a challenge at our border to make me brave enough to say it plainly. Elena felt tears she had refused to shed, since her binding day finally threatened to rise, though this time they came from something far different than humiliation. I love you too, she said. I have for longer than I've been willing to admit, even to myself. They stood together beneath the moon, the weight of tomorrow's contest heavy around them. But for the first time since her arrival at Ashwood, Elena did not feel like an outsider bracing for another blow. She felt like exactly what she was, Damon Cross's Luna, in every sense that mattered, standing beside the man she loved on the eve of a battle they intended to face, and win, together. The border between Ashwood and Thornfield had never seen so many gathered at once, both packs assembling at dawn along the wide clearing that marked the boundary between their territories. Mist still clung to the grass as warriors took their positions, and Elena stood near the rear, with Beatrice and a team of healers, the healing tents already prepared with everything they might need. Damon moved among his warriors one final time before the contest began, his presence steady and certain in a way that settled the nerves of even the youngest fighters. When he reached Elena, he paused, his eyes searching hers for a long moment. "Stay behind the healing line," he said. "No matter what happens." "I will," Elena promised. "Come back to me, Damon." "Always," he said, and then he was gone, moving to take his place at the front of Ashwood's line, as Kane emerged at the head of Thornfield's warriors, on the opposite side of the clearing. The contest, as tradition dictated, was not meant to be a full-scale conflict, but a structured engagement between chosen champions from each side, followed by a final confrontation between the two alphas themselves, if the matter remained unresolved. Elena watched, her heart in her throat, as Ashwood's champions moved through their engagements with a discipline and coordination that reflected weeks of intense preparation. Simon fought with a controlled ferocity that won Ashwood an early advantage, and the warriors Elena had helped train in basic field triage moved through their roles with the same steadiness she had modeled for them at Fenmore. But Thornfield's warriors were skilled as well, and the contest remained close as the morning stretched into afternoon, neither side gaining a decisive edge. By midday, exhaustion had begun to show on both sides, and it became clear the matter would not be settled by the champions alone. As tradition required, Damon and Kane stepped forward to meet at the center of the clearing, the assembled warriors falling back to give them space. Elena watched from the healing line, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, as the two alphas faced each other, everything between them, the old letters, the years of searching, the humiliating binding day, and everything that had grown from it, finally reaching its resolution. The confrontation between them was intense but controlled, both men skilled enough to test each other without recklessness, each searching for the advantage that would end the contest decisively. Elena forced herself to watch rather than look away, needing to see the outcome with her own eyes rather than wait for news secondhand. It was Damon's familiarity with the terrain, the same eastern ground Elena had helped map during the Fenmore crisis, that ultimately gave him the edge he needed. He used the uneven ground near the clearing's edge to his advantage, and after a tense, prolonged exchange, Kane found himself unable to press his advantage further, forced finally to yield. The clearing fell silent, as Kane, breathing hard, lowered his stance in formal acknowledgement of the contest's outcome. "The challenge is settled," Kane said, his voice carrying across the clearing despite his exhaustion. "Ashwood's claim stands. I withdraw my challenge, and Thornfield acknowledges the binding between Alpha Cross and Elena Voss as final." Damon straightened, his own breathing labored but his voice steady. "Then let this matter be closed between our packs, without further conflict between us." Kane nodded, and something in his expression, as he looked past Damon toward Elena standing at the healing line, seemed to finally accept what he had refused to accept for weeks. He approached slowly, and Elena stepped forward to meet him partway, unwilling to let the moment end without acknowledging it directly. "I hope you find what you were looking for, Elena," Kane said quietly. "I mean that sincerely, even now." "I already have," Elena said gently. "I hope you find it too, Kane. Somewhere, with someone who chooses you as freely as you wanted me to choose you." He held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded, and turned back toward his own warriors, beginning the process of withdrawing Thornfield's forces from the border, with the same composed dignity he had carried throughout his entire pursuit of her. Elena turned to find Damon making his way toward her, and she closed the remaining distance between them in a rush, relief flooding through her as she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything the day had carried. "You're hurt," she said, noticing a shallow cut along his forearm. "It's nothing," he said, though he allowed her to examine it anyway, some old instinct in him already learning to accept her care rather than deflect it. "It's over, Elena. It's finally over." "It's over," she echoed, and for a moment, standing in the middle of the clearing with both packs beginning to disperse around them, the world felt entirely still, entirely theirs. That evening, back within Ashwood's walls, Damon called the entire pack together in the great hall, the same hall where months earlier he had declared, in front of everyone, that Elena would be Luna, in name only. This time, as she stood beside him at the center of the room, his declaration carried an entirely different weight. "Months ago, in this very hall, I made a mistake I have spent every day since trying to correct," Damon said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "I told you that Elena Voss would carry the title of Luna without carrying my heart. I was wrong, and I was afraid, and I let an old wound speak for me, instead of the truth. The truth is this: Elena has earned every part of her place in this pack, not through the treaty that bound us, but through her own strength, her own compassion, and her own unwavering courage. She rode into danger to save Fenmore when I hesitated to send her. She built trust with this pack, one act of kindness at a time, even when I gave her every reason to stop trying. And when Thornfield threatened everything we have built together, she stood beside me without a single moment of doubt." He turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his in front of the entire gathered pack. "Elena Voss is my Luna, in every sense that word carries. Not in name only, but in full, in truth, and for the rest of the life I intend to build with her." The hall erupted into a warmth entirely different from the cold silence of her binding day, warriors and villagers alike cheering, Margaret wiping tears from her eyes near the back of the room, Beatrice smiling with quiet satisfaction, even Rosalind offering a genuine, respectful nod from her place among the council. Elena felt the weight of months of loneliness, humiliation, and quiet perseverance finally lift from her shoulders, replaced by something she had begun to fear she would never find within Ashwood's walls: a true home, a true partnership, and a love that had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger for it. "I told you once that titles were mine to write," Elena said quietly to Margaret later that evening, remembering the words spoken to her on her very first morning in Ashwood's kitchen. "I think I finally understand what you meant." "You wrote a good one," Margaret said, smiling. Luna of Ashwood, in full. Outside, the moon rose high over Ashwood's walls, the same moon that had witnessed Elena's loneliest nights, now witnessing her standing beside Damon, on the balcony overlooking the pack she had fought so hard to belong to, his arm around her waist, no distance left between them at all. "Whatever comes next," Damon said softly, "we face it together." "Together," Elena agreed, and as the pack below celebrated late into the night, she finally allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that the woman once called Luna in name only had become, through every trial that had tested her, Luna in every way that truly mattered.